Right there in the courtroom, Cole Davis roared, "What the hell does an old black man like you know about the law?" Then he swung his hand and slammed Samuel Grant's head against the wooden table, blood soaking the tissue paper red. But just as he was basking in his rage, a voice as cold as steel rang out, "Touch my father and you're touching the FBI." In that instant, the entire courtroom froze and shame turned into a sentence for the abuser. Justice never bows to violence. Which state are you in? That morning, the courtroom felt like a pressure cooker in visible heat pressing down on every wooden bench, weighing heavily on the shoulders of everyone present. The ceiling fans spun lazily, unable to dispel the thick tension in the air. All eyes were fixed on the witness stand, where an old man with silver hair slowly made his way forward with a cane, each step releasing a dry sound that tapped at the patience of the room. Samuel Grant, a man who had weathered decades of storms, stood not as a battle-ready warrior, but as a witness to a life tangled in pain and tested faith. He wore a faded brown suit, his cane striking a slow rhythm on the cold stone floor, leaving behind echoes of quiet sorrow. The murmurs in the back rows died down as he laid his wrinkled hand on the stand. In the silence, a voice cut through hoarse, yet sharp enough to pierce the stillness. "What does an old black man know about the law?" The speaker was Officer Cole Davis, a white cop seated up front, his eyes brimming with contempt, a cruel smirk curling at his lips. His words thickened the already suffocating air. A faint cough came from the back rows, a few uneasy glances shot his way, and hi-his quickly pulled back in fear of becoming targets themselves. Cole leaned back in his seat, arms crossed like a man who believed himself untouchable, exhaling arrogance into a room already heavy with tension. Samuel didn't respond immediately. He raised his head and looked straight at the man who had just insulted him. In his age-clouded eyes, a sharp glint appeared like a blade slashing through the dark. His voice dropped low and steady, each word falling like a stone into a still lake. "All I know is that justice does not rest in the hands of the violent." A few soft whispers rose, some covering their mouths in fear that Cole might hear their reactions. But the words had already cut through the room, striking directly at the pride of the uniformed man. Cole froze for a second, then suddenly sprang to his feet, his chair crashing back into the wall with a sharp bang. His boots hit the stone floor with heavy thuds, each step pounding like war drums into the hearts of the spectators. Towering and broad, he moved toward the witness stand, blocking the light from the tall windows behind him. His face was flushed with rage, his bloodshot eyes locked on Samuel like a predator sizing up frail prey. He came in close, his breath reeking of cigarettes and disdain pouring straight onto the old man. Without warning, Cole swung his arm, delivering a brutal slap across Samuel's face. The sharp sound echoed through the courtroom like a whip cracking against bare skin. Samuel's body slumped to one side, his head crashing onto the wooden table with a cold, hollow thud that made several people go pale. Bright red blood immediately burst from a wound on his forehead, streamed down his cheek, and soaked into the tissue paper beside him, spreading into a dark crimson blot. The metallic scent of blood drifted through the air, stirring a wave of suppressed outrage in the hearts of many. Everyone froze. Not a scream, not a hand raised in time to stop it. It had all happened too quickly, too violently. Even the judge sat frozen, the wooden gavel trembling in his hand, unable to strike. Samuel remained seated, breathing in shallow bursts, his trembling hand clutching the cane like a lifeline. His eyes were shut for a moment, then slowly opened, glowing fiercely as he stared straight at the man who had struck him. He didn't groan, didn't cry out, only shifted his body slightly to sit upright. Blood trickled down to his chin, but his gaze didn't waver. It was that calmness that unsettled people most, because it wasn't submission, it was a silent declaration that he would not let violence strip him of dignity. Cole stood at the stand, chest heaving, his eyes sweeping the courtroom like a beast that had just proven its dominance. He curled his lip into a smirk and threw a defiant glare toward the back rows. Some dropped their eyes. Others glanced cautiously, afraid his stare might fall on them. He jutted his chin and spat out words slow and venomous. "Here I am, the law." His voice echoed deep and rough, as if it meant to devour all resistance. The back rows stirred uneasily, but no one rose. Whispers flickered and faded, leaving behind a chilling silence. In one corner, a young law student gripped his notebook tightly, eyes wide in disbelief at what he was witnessing. On another bench, a middle-aged woman clutched her chest, tears spilling as she watched the humiliation unfold so blatantly. A few lawyers exchanged helpless glances. Even the judge could only shake his head slightly, as if struggling with his own cowardice. Everyone seemed bound by invisible chains where one slap had turned justice into a farce inside the very temple of law. Samuel, in the growing pool of blood on the table, did not collapse as many expected. He steadied himself, slowly turned his head so the room could see his blood-stained face and unwavering eyes. His voice, hoarse from pain but still firm, broke the silence. "Justice is not afraid of blood. It only dies when we all bow our heads." The words, though not loud, carried far, striking deep into the hearts of those who heard them. A shiver swept across the courtroom. That moment stretched endlessly, and everyone knew what had just happened would not end with a single slap. It would spread, it would erupt, it would become a fire no one could put out. Cole Davis's slap had not only struck the face of an old silver-haired man, but it had struck directly at the community's faith in justice. And in that heavy silence, the seed of a storm began to form, ready to sweep away every lie and abuse of power. The sound of the slap still echoed in the minds of everyone present, making the courtroom feel stifling, as if locked inside a dense fog. Chatter exploded in all directions, waves of chaotic noise crashing against the four walls, only to be abruptly silenced by Cole Davis's hoarse shout. He barked his voice, hammering through the room and startling many into stillness. "Sit down. I am the law here." Each word landed with the aggression of someone who believed that a uniform and a badge gave him the right to decide the fate of others. The rows of seats caved under fear. A few people nearly reacted, but stopped their eyes darting away, afraid that his stare might make them the next target. Amid the chaos, Samuel Grant remained motionless beside the witness stand. Blood from his forehead streamed down his cheek, mixing with the deep wrinkles carved by age. He reached for a tissue with a trembling hand, slowly wiping each trail of blood without hurry, his eyes still clear despite his staggering frame. When he tried to rise, the whole room fell quiet. They saw not just a frail old man, but a presence that radiated a calm so sharp hurt to witness. It was not surrender. It was a silent statement that dignity cannot be taken by force. Cole still stood in the center of the room, breathing heavily like a beast that had just landed a fatal blow. He watched Samuel wipe the blood away, then let out a sharp, cutting laugh that sliced through those listening. The air was stretched tight, and in that exact moment a voice rose unexpectedly from the lawyer's table. It came from a young man, thin and sharp-eyed, who slammed his hands on the table as if to summon courage. He shouted, "He's a witness. You have no right to treat him like that." The words rang through the courtroom, carrying a rare boldness in a sea of silence. Cole spun around, eyes bloodshot, face twisted with fury. He stormed toward the young lawyer, closing the distance in a few heavy steps, his shoes pounding the floor like a warning. His voice dropped into a snarl as he hissed each word like a blade. "Shut up. You want a slap too." The threat sent a cold shock through the room. Some women covered their mouths. A few men shifted in their seats only to sit back down as Cole's eyes swept over them. The courtroom now felt like a deep pit filled with gasoline needing only a spark to ignite. Rage was rising in every chest, but fear of power held them in place. Cole's tall figure blocked the room like a looming shadow, stripping away every voice that dared to resist. The judge's frantic gavel strikes did nothing to restore order, each knock weak and swallowed by the crowd's pounding breath. The choking silence turned into a collective humiliation, a wound everyone silently endured. Samuel stood still, his eyes turning toward the young lawyer, then slowly nodded as a gesture of gratitude. In that moment, their eyes met two generations, one seasoned by life, the other just stepping onto the path of justice, and they both understood that those words had been a small flame pushing back the darkness. But that flame was immediately targeted by Cole, who tried to snuff it out with raw intimidation. Whispers spread across the room, no longer scattered fragments, but a flood of stifled outrage. Some clenched their fists, some eyes turned red with held-back tears. Everyone wanted to rise, but fear held them down. The fury boiled beneath the silence like molten lava under a hardened crust. It was now undeniable that in this place, supposedly a stronghold of justice, a police officer had brazenly turned the courtroom into a stage for personal dominance. Cole scanned the room, his smug grin unshaken. He mistook the crowd's silence for victory, their fear for proof that power belonged to him. He held his head high, the hand that had struck Samuel still flushed red like a badge he wore with pride. On the gallery bench, a boy around 10 clutched his mother's hand, his eyes wide with fear, and in that instant no one could deny that this scene had seared itself into the mind of the next generation. The rage swelled like an undertow, yet still remained trapped within the four walls. The courtroom trembled not with screams, but with the tension between fear and fury. People began to realize the truth. Justice had been trampled in plain sight, and they were sitting motionless as witnesses to it. This was not only an insult to Samuel Gratt, but a scar carved into the soul of the entire community. In Cole's eyes, pride burned bright, but beneath it lingered a faint trace of dread. He knew somewhere deep down that the slap had gone too far, that those words had sparked an anger he could no longer contain. Yet, instead of pulling back, he leaned harder into arrogance, believing that shouting, "I am the law," could wipe the blood from Samuel's forehead, believing that threats could keep every mouth shut. What he didn't realize was that this moment would become the spark that consumed his career and his image. Because justice, though silent, always finds a way to speak. The crowd trembled, their restrained anger growing fiercer, yet no one moved, their eyes drifting away as if to avoid facing the truth of what had just happened. Outside the window, the sunlight turned harsh, cutting into the courtroom like a blinding slash of light, shining directly on Samuel's bloodied yet calm face. That image burned itself into everyone's mind, imprinting a brutal truth. When justice is turned into a joke, the silence of the crowd becomes the sound of complicity. The whispers could no longer be contained, spreading like fire through dry grass from the courtroom all the way into the long straight hallway of the courthouse, a space once filled only with the sound of lawyers' footsteps. The rustle of papers and quiet reminders now buzzed with hushed voices, short breaths and words no one dared say aloud. Light filtered through frosted windows, casting pale reflections onto the cold stone floor and the bodies packed together. People gathered in small clusters, walking and murmuring, their eyes scanning the hallway as if afraid someone might be listening. A middle-aged woman clutched her purse, trembling as she whispered to the person beside her, "If he dared to slap an old man right inside the courtroom, what do you think he'd do out there?" Her voice shook like a blade of grass in the wind, but her words sank deep into the hearts of those who heard them, leaving a silence heavy with helplessness. A war veteran in a worn coat pressed his lips together, his hand clenched into a fist, but he said nothing, knowing that even a single word of protest could make him the next target. Footsteps echoed on the stone floor, steady but charged with challenge. Cole Davis appeared in the hallway, tall, chin lifted, his gaze sweeping over each person. He strutted forward, his voice loud and careless, making sure everyone could hear. "I've taken down 3 like him already. One more won't make a difference." His cocky boast slashed through the air like a knife, making some people flinch and move closer to the walls. Eyes dropped to the floor. No one dared to meet his stare. Many held their breath, heads bowed as if the tiled ground had become the only safe place to look. Cole passed the silent groups, the sneer on his face growing. He saw their silence and fear as fuel for his authority. He saw their downcast eyes, their tightly shut lips, and he counted it as proof of control. His pace slowed as he noticed a young man pressed against the wall, eyes darting nervously, and he tossed him a cold, cutting glance that made the boy's whole body stiffen. Then Cole let out a quiet, mocking laugh, silent but sharp enough to tighten the hallway like a string about to snap. The people present tried to move away quickly, their shoes scraping softly across the floor as if to escape his line of sight. Some pretended to check their phones, others stared at their watches, all hoping to avoid locking eyes with that predatory glare. They knew one wrong look, one misplaced gesture, and they could be pulled into his unpredictable wrath. That long hallway had turned in an instant into a stage of fear, with Cole parading through it like a tyrant flaunting his unchecked power. Yet, amid the shrinking back and silence, a figure stood still at the far end of the hallway. A tall man in a blue suit, his eyes sharp as steel, his gaze cutting through the timid crowd. David Grant appeared quietly, but his presence felt like a barrier blocking the toxic air from spreading further. Light from the window fell across his tense features, casting a strange glow that made even a passing glance feel like walking into a force field. He said nothing, just stood there, arms relaxed at his sides, one hand slowly tightening, eyes locked on Cole as he marched forward. In that moment, the long hallway seemed to collapse into a single straight line, connecting two men at opposite ends, one full of swagger, drunk on false powers, the other standing silent but with an icy stare that pulled the atmosphere taut. The whispers stopped. All eyes turned toward the end of the hall, where an unspoken confrontation had begun to take shape. No one knew who David Grant was, but by the way he stood and the way he looked, he was unlike anyone who had just lowered their head and walked past. Cole stopped when his eyes met the steel gaze across from him. For a brief second, he hesitated, then let out a mocking smirk, assuming this man was no different from the rest, just another bystander. But David's gaze didn't flinch. It was cold, direct, and sharp, like a blade at the throat. No one said a word, but everyone in the hallway felt their heartbeat skip. A breeze slipped through the cracked window, sweeping down the corridor, making the curtains stir. And in that rustling silence, people could hear their own hearts pounding. Someone whispered to the person beside them, "Who is that guy? He doesn't look like someone here for the trial." The other just shook their head slightly, eyes fixed on the strange moment unfolding. People started to sense something different in the way the man in the blue suit stood, an underlying confidence, a cold calm that clashed with their own panic. What none of them knew was that within minutes his name would shake this entire room. Cole took a deep breath, trying to hold on to his arrogant smile. He stepped forward a few more paces, his voice dropping low enough for those nearby to hear another idiot standing around watching. "I'll show you what curiosity costs." But David didn't move his eyes, unblinking, not a single muscle in his face twitching. In that stillness, something unseen began to rise, and those watching felt their bodies stiffen in response. That hallway, just a minute earlier, filled with fear and humiliation, had now become a place where every eye was fixed on a single point, where one man's silence could serve as the sharpest form of defiance. Cole Davis still puffed himself up, but his smile twisted slightly when he saw that his gaze did not falter, and the people watching began to understand that something was about to happen, something that would shatter the balance of fear that had taken hold of this place. At the end of the hallway, where the light from the window scattered into patches of brightness and shadow, the air thickened like an invisible curtain draping over every movement. Footsteps echoed in a steady rhythm, each step landing against the cold stone floor and climbing up the arched walls, creating a dry resonance that made anyone who heard it feel as though their chest had just been struck. The man in the blue suit walked from one end of the hall, tall and upright, shoulders squared, his pace unhurried. hurried but firm. Each step seemed to slice through the suffocating tension that had wrapped the atmosphere. No one knew who he was yet, but his presence stood in stark contrast to the lowered heads and averted gazes that had bent beneath Cole Davis's glare. David Grant walked in silence, light slanting from the hallway windows, brushing across his face, revealing eyes as deep as a midnight lake. People lining the walls stepped aside instinctively, small groups edging closer to the wall, their shoulders brushing against legal portraits that had hung there for years unnoticed. Now, every eye was fixed on the figure drawing nearer, not hurried, not showy, but enough to make those who had just avoided Cole's path shiver involuntarily. Nearby, Samuel Grant still sat on the bench against the wall, blood from his forehead soaking the front of his shirt, forming a stark red streak on the pale fabric. The slanted light caught the bloodstain, making it glow bright like a wound etched into the room. David stopped, his eyes locked on his father, on the trail of dried blood distorted across his chest. His heart clenched, and in a flash, childhood memories flooded back, his father gripping his hand through smoky streets, telling him, "The longest road always leads to justice, but someone has to be strong enough to walk it to the end." That lesson echoed now in his mind, blending with the fury rising in him, restrained beneath a cold exterior. Cole Davis stood in the middle of the hall, tall and rigid, shoulders tight with arrogance. After the slap and shouting in the courtroom, he was still riding high. But when he caught David's stare, something unfamiliar brushed past him. Still, rather than back down, he doubled down, flaunting his bravado. He smirked, revealing a half-mocking grin, then raised his voice just enough for the entire hallway to hear. "So the son came to see his old man's humiliation too, huh?" The final words rang out, echoing across the arched ceiling, as if trying to etch the insult into every heart present. Everyone held their breath. The sentence cut through the air like a blade, leaving behind a deadly silence after it rang out. Some women raised their hands to their mouths. A few men shook their heads in helpless disbelief, but no one had the courage to speak. They feared Cole's stare, feared the rage of a man in uniform, feared that what had just happened in the courtroom might erupt again, right here. David still said nothing. He kept walking, step by step, not fast, but with a weight that made the stone floor seem to tremble. His eyes stayed fixed on Cole, not with explosive fury or anxious tension, but with a coldness like a sheathed blade. Anyone who met that gaze felt a chill run through them. The crowd on either side of the hallway instinctively stepped back, clearing a straight path between the two men. The whispers vanished. No murmurs remained, only the pounding hearts of those watching, trying to hide their anticipation. The distance between them narrowed, the slanting light casting their shadows long across the floor. On one side was Cole, standing proud, his eyes filled with the same aggressive glare people had grown used to. On the other was David, silent, his face frozen like a block of ice. Their eyes locked, clashing without mercy. This was no exchange between two men, it was a confrontation between two opposing worlds. One believed power came from shouting over the truth. The other believed that silence held at the right moment could crush arrogance entirely. The hallway felt compressed like a thin wire suspended between them. Every glance sliced across it, threatening to snap it at any second. Some people gripped each other's hands, a few stared wide-eyed, and others breathed rapidly. They understood this was not just a face-off. It was the spark that could ignite a storm. Cole took half a step forward, his breath hot, his lips pressed tight to hold back another curse. He saw no fear in David's eyes, no shrinking, no flinch, none of the reactions he was used to provoking. Instead, that gaze remained still and razor-sharp, as if peering straight into every hidden stain Cole had ever buried. That silence disturbed him more than shouting ever could. For a brief second, his smirk faltered, but he lifted his head, clinging to the posture of someone still pretending to rule the room. David stopped the space between him and Cole now just a few paces. He tilted his head slightly, the light catching his face and sharpening the cold in his eyes. He said nothing, but his hand subtly tightened at his side, a small motion that sent a wave of tension through the crowd. They understood now this wasn't a random appearance. It marked a turning point. The man in the blue suit was no mere spectator. He was the doorway to a confrontation no one would be able to avoid. In that moment, a soft gust of wind slipped through the crack in the door, making the curtain sway. The sound blended with the sudden halt of footsteps, forming a breathless rhythm. The hallway, packed with people, had gone so silent you could hear a pin drop. Every gaze was locked on the center, where two figures stood frozen in an unrelenting stare, one radiating reckless defiance, the other unreadable coldness. And there, time seemed to vanish, leaving only the sense that they were witnessing a moment that would change everything. After a short recess, the atmosphere inside the courtroom grew even heavier. People filed in from the hallway, slowly returning to their seats, but no one could shake the image of blood soaking through the front of Samuel Grant's shirt. The tension blanketed everything, like the stone walls were holding back a storm ready to break. The judge resumed his seat, his stern expression betraying a trace of unease, as even he had never witnessed such chaos in his courtroom. The lawyers adjusted their files, trying to mask their nervous glances. The audience whispered among themselves, many still trembling with a mix of fear and outrage. In the front row, Samuel was helped in by his son. David Grant walked slowly, one hand resting firmly on his father's shoulder, like a shield steadying the man who was still reeling from the brutal slap. Their every step echoed, making the whole courtroom turn to watch. Light from the high windows poured down, illuminating the blood still visible on Samuel's collar, a wound that stood as both living evidence and undeniable stain on Cole Davis. David pulled the chair out gently, helping his father sit with care, his movements calm but his eyes storming, locked on the man still sitting smugly across the room. Cole Davis leaned to one side, his fingers tapping a steady beat on the table, trying to broadcast composure. But when David's cold stare met his, he faltered for a second, then quickly forced a crooked grin, the kind that tried to mask uncertainty with menace. His voice rang out across the packed room, sharp and loaded. "Who the hell are you to walk in here like this?" The question came like a challenge, an attempt to put anyone in their place who dared to enter the power game he believed he controlled. David didn't answer immediately. He stood tall, his eyes darkening like storm clouds before they break. The entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath, every gaze fixed on the mysterious man in the blue suit. A pause stretched long enough to quicken every heartbeat, then David reached into his inner jacket pocket and pulled out a badge. He held it up and spoke, his voice clear and cut in each word, landing like a hammer blow against the wooden bench. "I am David Grant, Federal Agent, FBI." The declaration sliced through the air, triggering a shockwave no one had expected. The courtroom exploded. Petish exploded into whispers. Heads turned, voices overlapped, and a few gasps rang out in disbelief. The judge's gavel struck repeatedly, but no one calmed down. The lawyers stared, wide-eyed, papers falling to the floor unnoticed. Spectators rose to their feet, staring at David like he had stepped out of nowhere, bringing with him the power to flip the entire room on its head. Cole Davis froze, his face stiffened, eyes wide, mouth slightly open, but unable to form a single word. For the first time, his voice, his usual weapon for dominating others, vanished into useless silence. He couldn't believe the man who had walked through the hallway without reacting to insults was in fact an FBI agent. That name echoed in his mind, each syllable dropping like stone, crushing the overconfidence that had always fueled his every move. Samuel sat quietly, blood still marking his face, watching his son stand tall and declare his identity. His aged eyes gleamed with pride mixed with relief, but he said nothing, knowing that David's presence now spoke louder than any word. The crowd looked at him, looked at his son, then turned to Cole, realizing the balance of power had shifted. Cole's earlier slap now felt like a hammer falling on his own head, because the man he thought was a helpless victim turned out to have a strength no one had anticipated. The murmurs didn't stop. Phones were discreetly raised. snapping photos capturing a moment already beginning to feel historic. Someone whispered, he said, FBI. He really is FBI. The words spread like ripples overlapping and growing. A young woman, tears in her eyes, gripped her friend's hand and whispered, Justice finally has someone on our side. Every whisper, every exchanged glance became another brick in the wall rising against Cole's arrogance. Cole swallowed hard, his hand tightening unconsciously, veins rising along his knuckles. He wanted to respond to shout, but the words caught in his throat. What he had just witnessed, the calm way David had stood, that steel gaze now swirled around him, pressing down like a weight he couldn't shake. For the first time in years, he felt his legs rooted the chair beneath him, no longer steady. David lowered the badge, slid it back into his jacket, then fully turned to face Cole. He didn't need to yell, didn't need to threaten. His stare alone pulled the entire crowded room into silence. That silence no longer came from fear of Cole, but from attention to the man who had just shifted the entire dynamic. In everyone's eyes, from that moment on, Cole was no longer the one in control, but a man standing on the edge of a cliff with nowhere to go. The courtroom surged with a new kind of tension. On one side stood Cole, who had just delivered a violent blow and now sat like a cracked statue. On the other hand was David, the son, who had stepped forward, revealed his identity, and carried undeniable power. In between sat Samuel, unmoving, his blood-stained face lit with the glow of renewed belief. And all around them, for the first time that morning, the crowd felt something close to hope. Thin, fragile, but strong enough to keep them in their seats, waiting to see what would come next. In that moment, the courtroom was no longer just a place for legal proceedings. It had become an arena where raw arrogance faced off against quiet justice. Everyone understood that from the instant David Grant revealed his identity, the entire game had shifted. Cole Davis, though still seated with his face flushed red, had lost the advantage he once believed to be an impenetrable wall. The moment Cole Davis slapped Samuel Grant across the face, slamming his head against the table and staining the tissue paper with blood, left more than just a deep wound in the courtroom. It was also unknowingly caught by a hidden phone lens. From a dimly lit back row where few paid attention, a young law student had quietly raised his phone, his hand trembling but determined. He didn't know what would come of it, only that the scene couldn't disappear into silence, that corrupted power couldn't be allowed to bury the truth. When the room erupted with the revelation of David Grant's FBI identity, the student quickly hit save, preserving the footage as a living piece of evidence. Just minutes after court resumed, he slipped out, face pale with tension, both hands clutching the phone. In a small room across the hallway where Cole was nowhere in sight, he opened Twitter. Without overthinking, he typed the caption, "Cop slaps old black man in courtroom," and attached the short, less than 1 minute video. His finger hit post as his heart pounded like signing a contract to stand against silence. In that instant, the video began its journey beyond the courthouse walls, diving headfirst into the sea of social media. At first, there were only a few dozen views, then a few hundred, but in less than 10 minutes, the number shot into the thousands. The image of Cole's hand striking Samuel, the burst of blood, the old man's calm expression followed by David's steel gaze, it was all too much to believe. That this had happened in a courtroom where justice was supposed to live stunned viewers. The first comments came fast, short, and furious. If this happens in court, where's the law? More accounts shared it, and with every repost came more outrage, more sparks thrown into the fire. Within an hour, the hashtag #JusticeForSamuel had surged to the top of the trending list. Tens of thousands joined in, each adding a piece to the growing wave of fury. Someone wrote, "If an old man with silver hair isn't safe in a courtroom, who's safe anywhere?" Another left a trembling comment. "I saw my father in him. This is a stain that can't be forgiven." Every word felt like a blade cutting through the mask of Cole Davis's authority. The wave grew so fast at T that the student himself was overwhelmed. His phone buzzed nonstop with notifications, the screen lighting up as shares skyrocketed. Independent news outlets were the first to pick up the video, replaying it during roundtable live streams. One anchor stared straight into the camera, eyes red with anger. "What are we witnessing?" An elderly man was assaulted inside a courtroom by the very man who wears a badge sworn to protect justice. That voice clip was cut and reshared alongside the video, turning it into a blazing packet of truth passed hand to hand across the digital world. By that afternoon, the major news outlets had joined the storm. CNN aired the video during prime time with a bold red headline, "Cop assaults elderly black man in courtroom. Outrage erupts nationwide." BBC reposted it with the caption, "An image forcing America to confront one question: where is justice?" Al Jazeera ran a live panel discussion bringing in social analysts. They spoke of violence, of discrimination, of a broken system, all centered around a 58-second clip that had the power to awaken an entire community. In coffee shops, people leaned in close to their phones, debating heatedly. In lecture halls, students gathered around a laptop, watching and arguing. On subway trains, the blue glow of phone screens lit up tense faces as commuters stared at the footage of Samuel being struck down. Across city blocks, from quiet corners to towering skyscrapers, the question echoed everywhere. If this can happen in court, what meaning does justice even have? The tension quickly spread beyond the bounds of an isolated incident. It became the topic of the hour across every platform. Celebrities joined in, from basketball stars to singers, each reposting the video with a short but weighty caption, "Justice for Samuel." Their voices were like wind fanning an already raging fire. In less than 24 hours, the video had reached millions of views, replayed on television, broadcast on the radio, and shared in households across the nation. The country was forced to confront a brutal truth: a police officer inside a courtroom had assaulted a vulnerable, elderly black man, and that truth could no longer be buried. Cole Davis, who once believed shouting, "I am the law," could silence all resistance, had become the center of national contempt, watched by millions as the embodiment of everything broken in the system he represented. David Grant made no further statement that day, but the image of him standing silently beside his father, eyes locked coldly on Cole, was clipped into the video and turned into a symbol of shifting power. People wrote, "The old man is not alone. Justice has someone standing beside it." That phrase, repeated everywhere, printed over images, reshared across platforms, becoming an unspoken message that spread throughout the community. In the days that followed, television channels continued airing the clip. Commentary shows dissected every second: the shout from Cole, the slap, the blood, Samuel's stare, and David's silence before revealing his badge. Frame by frame, they zoomed in, froze moments, and anchors said, "This is when justice was humiliated, and also when the people were reminded that truth cannot be buried." From a short video clip, the story spread beyond a small county courtroom, becoming a national issue and a global debate. Every eye turned toward the incident, and Cole Davis, once a powerful police officer, became the defining image of corruption. It all began with a single tap on a phone screen, with the bold decision of a young law student, and with the moment justice was struck down in the very place it was meant to be protected. The city's central square had never been as crowded as it was that night. Candles were lit, glowing like a sea of trembling light, and the wind reflected on signs held high by hundreds of people. "We can't stay silent" appeared everywhere, from simple cardboard scraps to professionally printed banners, all raised together to form a wall of words standing against the darkness of abuse. People poured in from every direction, from narrow streets, old apartment blocks, and university campuses. The sound of footsteps merged with unified chants, forming a roar louder than the usual blare of traffic in the heart of the city. The air crackled with energy, each candle not just a light, but a vow not to be silent. On the high steps, a young student took the mic, his voice booming through the speakers. "It's him today, but it could be our parents tomorrow." The words rang out, hitting the hearts of everyone present. The crowd went still for a moment, then erupted with a thunderous chant, voices rising in unison from 1,000 throats. Justice for Samuel, justice for all. It was no longer just a slogan. It was fury, released, fear transformed into collective strength. Night fell, but the square glowed like daylight with thousands of phone flashlights and flickering candles. Each person held a small symbol in their hand, but together the crowd became a giant torch. Live stream cameras panned slowly, capturing every moment and broadcasting it to millions around the world. On the other end of the screen, people watched from tiny apartments, coffee shops, or subway cars holding their breath. View counts skyrocketed as millions of eyes watched at once, millions of hearts pounding with shared outrage. Every comment scrolling across the screen was like oil on fire. "We won't let the truth be buried. Samuel is a father to all of us. This isn't about one man, this is a fight for justice." The words danced and repeated like a voiceless choir, and in the center of the square, Samuel's face, wrapped in a white bandage, appeared on hastily printed posters held high by countless hands. That image became a symbol, spreading fast, no edits, no need for dramatic effects. Just one dried streak of blood on an old man's face was enough to silence anyone who saw it. Elderly people with canes came to, gripping the hands of young protesters. Mothers carried babies chanting while rocking them gently on their shoulders. Even witnesses from the courtroom earlier that day now stood in the crowd, their eyes shining, as if they had found a shared voice. The square no longer held lines of wealth, skin color, or age. Everyone became pieces of a living wall standing together against blind power. In one corner of the square, a group of students set up a large screen replaying the video of the slap. The entire crowd fell silent at once, eyes locked on the image of Cole Davis swinging his hand, Samuel's blood spraying across the frame. That moment lit up the screen, followed by a close-up of David's eyes as he stood beside his father. When the video paused on that frame, thousands of people raised their signs in unison, and the roar that followed shook the entire square. The live stream captured it all, and in that exact second, viewers everywhere felt the same chill ripple through them. Music began to play, not cheerful tunes, but protest songs, anthems that had marched alongside movements throughout history. The raspy voice of a middle-aged man rang through the microphone, blending with the steady clapping of the crowd. Candles were passed from hand to hand, their flickering light flowing like a glowing river through the darkness. In the singing, Samuel's image with the white bandage wrapped around his head and a calm gaze appeared on phone screens, becoming the shared center of attention. Major news outlets continued broadcasting scenes from the square in their live report. One anchor said, "This is not just a protest for one man, it's the voice of a community rising when one person's pain becomes the reason thousands take to the streets." Each broadcast pulled more people in as caravans from suburbs entered the city. Small groups merged into the larger crowd, turning the square into an endless sea of people. Among them was a boy holding a hand-drawn sign that read, "Dad, I stand with you." The image was picked up by a live stream camera and immediately went viral. People cried. People held each other tight because they understood this was no longer just a legal case. It had become a fire lighting the hearts of a generation. Samuel wasn't at the square that night. He remained in his hospital room, but his presence was everywhere. People chanted his name, sang his name, and treated him as a symbol of endurance and dignity. And somewhere in that quiet room, Samuel surely heard the echoes from the square, the call of a community that had turned him from a victim into a symbol. That night, as millions watched through their screens, someone posted a simple but powerful status. "We are not silent anymore." The words were shared hundreds of thousands of times, becoming the unofficial slogan of the protest. Every person who read it, every voice that repeated it laid another brick in the wall of justice Cole Davis would never be able to tear down. The square erupted not just in chance, but in a newfound belief. The belief that truth, once exposed, would never again be buried. And in that candlelit night, history recorded another moment when the voices of ordinary people joined together to become a storm that swept away the arrogance of power. While the wave of protests still raged in the square inside the district police office, the air was thick with a heavy, suffocating silence. This had once been the place where Cole Davis strode in with arrogant swagger, his boots pounding on the tiled floor like a declaration of power. But now, as he opened the door and stepped inside, no one looked up to greet him. The same colleagues who used to slap him on the back, drink with him, and laugh loudly and crudely at post-shift parties now avoided his gaze, quietly shuffling papers or pretending to be busy behind their screens. The clatter of typing filled the room, but the tension was sharp in every breath. Cole could feel the avoidance, and the silence hit like hidden blades beneath armor. He walked through the hallway, shoulders high, smirking in defiance to mask his unease. But even he knew his standing in this building was crumbling. One former partner accidentally met his eyes and quickly turned away, face tight with discomfort, fingers clenched around a folder like a lifeline. The cold distance enraged Cole, a man who had once believed brute authority would always command obedience, but now that same aggression had made him a pariah. While he tried to maintain composure outside on social media, pieces of his past were being unearthed without mercy. An independent journalist had dug up an old report stating that Cole had once assaulted a black inmate in a holding cell years ago. The case had been dismissed at the time for lack of evidence, but now, in a moment of national fury, the report caught fire like dry grass. The story spread fast, shared thousands of times within hours, and the public began asking the obvious question: how is someone with a violent history still wearing a badge? It didn't stop there. A former officer who had once worked alongside Cole came forward anonymously on a private forum. The tone was direct Cole. He liked hurting the weak, thought it made him strong. "I saw him beat handcuffed suspects more than once. Sometimes he even smiled like their pain was a reward." The accusation hit like a knife to Cole's public image. Within minutes, it was screenshotted and circulated widely. News blogs seized the quote, turning it into headline material. The comment section filled with outrage, each response like another crashing wave battering a wall already cracking. As if to pour gasoline on the fire, old photos began to surface. One showed him in a jail, his hand gripping the collar of a frail black inmate, his eyes filled with unmistakable satisfaction. Another captured him, slamming a young protester to the ground, baton clenched in his hand, face flushed red with rage. Though the images were blurry, hastily taken, and poorly framed in the current context, every shot became undeniable proof of Cole's violent tendencies. They spread across social media at lightning speed, followed by thousands of angry comments. "He's been doing this for years. This wasn't an accident. This is who he is." How many people suffered in silence because of him? International news outlets joined in. CNN brought on a sociologist who spoke in a calm, deliberate tone. This isn't an isolated incident. It's a pattern that shows what happens when power is placed in the wrong hands. It becomes a weapon against the vulnerable. The quote was immediately shared far and wide, directly tied to Cole Davis's name. BBC replayed footage of the protest-filled square, dubbing over it with commentary. They're not just protesting a slap, they're protesting the system that protected Cole for years. Inside the police station, Cole sat alone in his office, eyes, bloodshot sweat streaking his forehead despite the air conditioning blasting at full strength. His phone vibrated constantly on the desk like messages flooding in. A few were from former friends or family. "Don't contact me again. You should disappear." Old co-workers, once shoulder to shoulder with him on shifts, now sent clipped texts. "Leave my name out of this." Each message cut deeper into his isolation. Cole clutched the phone, eyes wild with rage, then slammed it down hard enough to crack the screen. In that moment, he no longer looked like a powerful cop, but a man trapped inside four walls, surrounded by scattered papers and a growing sense of defeat. The message alert still chimed, but Cole didn't bother picking up the phone. He leaned back, eyes shut tight, searching for an escape in his mind, but all he could see was Samuel's bloodied stare and David's cold steel gaze. He remembered that moment in court when his fist struck an old man's face, and for the first time the pleasure he once took in domination twisted into a nightmare that clung to him. The silence was shattered as Cole suddenly sprang to his feet, fist slamming into the desk. The crash echoed, the lamp shook, and a glass of water toppled, smashing on the floor. He roared, voice bouncing off the empty hallway. "You're all sheep. I'm the one holding the whip." The words burst out like the last gasp of defiance he could cling to, but only revealed his growing desperation. Even he knew the whip had splintered, and the sheep he mocked were becoming wolves, backing him into a corner. Outside, the community kept screaming for justice. Candles still burned brightly through the night, and the hashtag #JusticeForSamuel continued to climb the charts. Meanwhile, within these cold, confined walls, Cole Davis sat adrift in the very fortress that once shielded him, now isolated and trembling under the weight of a past dug up without mercy. That past had resurfaced like a massive iceberg, tearing straight through the arrogant ship he once believed unsinkable, leaving him stranded in a storm of fury with no way out. The city's press briefing room was brightly lit, the seats packed with reporters holding up cameras and microphones like a forest of metal. On the podium stood an official in a dark suit, his face stiff eyes avoiding the lenses. He spoke in a flat tone, no highs or lows, repeating hollow phrases. "We will review the matter." The dry words dropped into the stifling air like a wet rag thrown on a fire, failing to extinguish anything, only thickening the smoke. The room buzzed with whispers, arms shot up fast, and reporters jostled to get their questions in. A young journalist stood abruptly, eyes locked on the podium. His voice rang out. "If someone can be assaulted inside a courtroom, who protects citizens outside?" The question sliced through the air, and the official's face flickered. He fumbled with his notes, then responded in circles, repeating terms like internal review, evaluation period, formal report to follow. But the more he spoke, the more the crowd's anger swelled, everyone seeing through the cowardly evasion, the vague hedging that answered none of the outrage flooding the street. Microphones, pressed toward the edge of the table cameras, flashed non-stop, the lights flickering like blades, catching each drop of sweat on the official's brow. Reporters fired relentless questions, each cutting deeper. "Do you consider Cole Davis's actions a blatant violation? Why did he remain in position for years despite repeated allegations? Who enabled this violence?" The room grew hotter under the pounding inquiries, the official leaning back, his voice trembling. "We will thoroughly investigate. Please remain calm." But calm was no longer an option, and the backlash only grew louder. Outside the hall, citizens gathered in groups watching the briefing on a large screen set up in front of City Hall. With every evasive answer broadcast, the crowd erupted in boos, many raising handwritten signs that read, "Silence is complicity." Disappointment burned in their eyes. They didn't want empty promises. They wanted action. They wanted the violent man brought to justice. A mother holding her child wept when the phrase, "We will review the matter," played again, her eyes swollen with rage. An old veteran growled to someone beside him, "If they can't protect Mr. Samuel, who can they protect?" The press conference ended in chaos. The official hurried out the back door, dodging cameras, leaving behind a team of aides to gather papers under the furious stares of reporters. Questions went unanswered, glaring gaps in accountability exposed under broad daylight. And just minutes later, the clip of the official saying, "We will review the matter," flooded social social media becoming the new symbol of government evasion. A wave of furious comments followed. "We don't need promises, we need justice. If the government stays silent, we'll speak up instead." The community's anger swelled again, ready to erupt into a stronger wave, no longer willing to accept delay or deflection. Outside the hall, the crowd stood shoulder to shoulder, watching every word from the official on a large screen. The moment "we will review the matter" was heard, loud boos broke out. Dozens of arms shot into the air. Signs filled the sky with scrawled words, "Empty promises." The sound echoed off the stone walls of City Hall, becoming a tidal wave rolling through every street. A group of young people chanted, voices hoarse but fierce. "We are tired of being ignored." Their unified cry rang out of the soundtrack to a storm of rising outrage. Children, perched on their parents' shoulders, looked around, wide-eyed, while the adults locked arms, forming an unbreakable circle. Amid the noise, a news camera panned to the front row where David Grant stood in the crowd. His face was calm, his eyes bright as they scanned the sea of angry citizens. He stepped onto the makeshift platform the community had assembled, and the noise slowly faded as people realized the man at the center of the storm had arrived. Without a microphone, David raised his voice, every word clear and firm. "We will act, not stay silent." The words dropped like a hammer blow, cutting through the haze, reigniting a flame of hope. The crowd erupted, cheers rising like thunder. Many lifted their phones to capture the moment, live streaming it across social media. Within minutes, David's simple sentence had spread everywhere. The phrase, "we will act, not stay silent," appeared repeatedly in comments, becoming a new rallying cry to replace frustration. A quick-handed journalist tweeted, "Officials make empty promises, but David Grant promises action. The line has been drawn." The post was shared thousands of times alongside the image of David, standing tall in the crowd, a steady pillar amid the storm. In the dimming light of late afternoon, the faces of those present came into sharp focus. They looked at one another, eyes burning brighter, not just with anger, but with resolve. A student turned to his friend, voice trembling. He spoke up, "We can't back down now." The other nodded firmly, clutching his hand as if drawing strength from the word. Elderly men and women leaned slightly on their canes, eyes glistening because they understood a new generation was stepping up to carry the weight they once bore. David didn't say much more, but with a single sentence he accomplished what long-winded speeches from officials never could. The crowd chanted his name, chanted Samuel's name in rhythm with the steady drumming from a group of youth in the corner of the square. The heavy, gray sky seemed to brighten under the force of community will. The declaration not to stay silent was no longer just a phrase. It had become a collective current pushing the government's evasion back into the shadows. The people knew that from that moment on they had found a voice to lead them, and they would never again let justice be buried beneath empty promises. As David Grant's words continued to stir the Square, international media quickly picked up the story. Major news outlets reported in unison. CNN opened its evening broadcast with the bold headline, "Police Officer Slaps Black Witness in Courtroom. Outrage erupts nationwide." BBC posed a pointed question. If justice can be struck down inside a courtroom, who is safe outside? Al Jazeera aired a long-form segment inviting scholars and human rights activists to weigh in, stressing that this was no isolated incident, but a mirror reflecting long-standing fractures in law enforcement. Headlines rang out like warning bells no one could pretend not to hear. At the same time, protests spread beyond the city's borders. In neighboring states, thousands took to the streets holding hastily painted red-letter signs high into the night air. In every square, candles flared up again, crowds packed shoulder to shoulder, the chant, "Justice for Samuel," echoing like a chorus. Streets once filled with traffic became seas of people so dense that traffic officers gave up control. In some places, the marches stretched for miles from city centers to outer suburbs. The sound of footsteps blending with steady drum beats, turning tension into collective power. Local broadcasters streamed non-stop, cutting between shots of marching crowds and Samuel's face, a white bandage across his forehead, eyes calm. His image became a symbol, printed on shirts, pasted on walls, projected onto giant LED screens in major city squares. People didn't just call out Samuel's name, they shouted David's too, seeing him as a banner, a voice that dared to say, not stay silent, while officials still evaded. The chants rolled across states like unstoppable waves, crashing against the silence of those in power. At universities, students held public forums hanging banners that read, "Silence is complicity." Lecture halls, once quiet, now rang with heated debate as the younger generation vowed to turn outrage into action plans. In churches, pastors raised Samuel's image from the pulpit, declaring that the belief in human dignity is a sacred flame no one can extinguish. In small suburban communities that had never seen protests before, people lit candles and joined hands in circles, affirming that they too shared one voice. The pressure grew so intense that many politicians were forced to speak. Some tried to calm the public with promises of thorough investigations, others used it as a chance to attack rival systems. But regardless of their motives, none could drown out the collective voice rising from the streets. The nation seemed to be undergoing a social earthquake where the pounding footsteps and angry eyes had long surpassed the courtroom where it all began. And in that upheaval, the truth behind the slap was no longer just the story of an old man or a single family, but a flame-forging shared belief spreading from a small city to the heart of America. As protests reached across state lines, the video's impact spread beyond the general public and touched artists, athletes, and global influencers. A world-famous singer with tens of millions of followers reposted the clip with the simple caption, "Justice is not built on violence." Within hours, the post drew millions of likes, paving the way for a surge of support from other public figures. A basketball star declared, "Samuel Grant is the image of my father, of everyone who deserves respect. We cannot stay silent." Each statement landed like a hammer blow against Cole Davis's arrogance, turning him into a symbol of rot that had to be purged. On Instagram, major accounts posted the image of Samuel with the white bandage across his forehead, tagged with the hashtag #JusticeForSamuel. The phrase shot to #1, globally surpassing top entertainment and sports topics. Twitter roared with activity. Posts accompanied by the clip were translated into multiple languages, appearing in Europe, Asia, and Africa. A Kenyan track star wrote, "When justice falls in America, the whole world sees it." A French filmmaker added, "That moment crossed borders, becoming a reminder to all of humanity about the value of equality." International media didn't miss the momentum. News broadcasts repeatedly showed celebrities sharing the clip, using it to prove that this outrage was no longer confined to one nation. Late-night talk shows devoted entire segments to analyzing the global hashtag phenomenon, inviting guests from diverse fields to weigh in. One international law scholar noted, "When millions of people, from politicians and artists to everyday citizens, echo the same message, the story no longer belongs to the legal system alone. It becomes a societal symbol." At every protest, people carried phones with the clip already playing, holding them high for the crowd to see. Each time the image of the slap replayed, the crowd roared in outrage, then shouted in unison, "Justice for Samuel." That scene was quickly recorded, posted, and shared again, creating a viral loop that grew into a media storm like nothing before. Across city walls, murals of Samuel began to appear, his aged face wrapped in a white bandage, becoming a powerful image painted by unknown artists, echoing like the beat of a drum. What started as a slap in a courtroom had now transformed transformed into a new symbol for the movement against discrimination. It was no longer simply a question of an assault, but a wake-up call to an entire society about the long-standing fractures beneath the surface. Each time the hashtag appeared online, it served as a reminder that human dignity cannot be erased by arrogance. Samuel Grant, the quiet man who stepped up to the witness stand, had now become the face of resistance, a figure through whom the global community could reflect and find a shared voice. From there, the story broke past the boundaries of the legal system, past the fences of any single city, to stand tall as a symbol for a generation that dares to say no to injustice and to affirm that justice will always belong to dignity. At the FBI headquarters, the cold, white light from rows of neon bulbs reflected off desks cluttered with case files, computers, and steaming cups of coffee. David Grant stepped into the conference room, his face tense, but his eyes clear, showing unwavering determination. In front of him sat his trusted colleagues, investigators, who had stood with him through many complex cases. Without any preamble, David spoke firmly. "I'm requesting a full-scale investigation. Every piece of evidence, every witness, anything connected to Cole Davis must be collected immediately." His voice rang out, not just as a command, but as a declaration that justice needed to be restored. The investigators nodded silently, exchanging glances that showed they understood this was unlike any case they had worked on before. On the large screen at the front of the room, the video of Cole Davis's slap replayed. Every frame, from the hand strike in Samuel's face to the blood staining the napkin, was now undeniable evidence. The younger agents stared at the screen, many clenching their fists, driven not just by duty, but by personal outrage. By the end of the day, the team was divided into multiple units. One group was tasked with collecting every version of the video posted on social media, verifying authenticity and tracing the original uploader. Another group began contacting everyone present in the courtroom, from lawyers and students to anonymous spectators. Statements were drafted, every word carefully recorded to match the footage. Each account added another piece to the puzzle, revealing a clear and damning picture. The atmosphere inside the FBI office grew intense. Phones rang constantly, printers worked non-stop, and thick files piled up across desks. David didn't just issue orders, he personally joined smaller meetings and sometimes made calls to witnesses himself. He spoke in a calm, steady voice. "The truth is on our side, and it needs your testimony." His sincerity and authority reassured many who had been afraid, now stepping forward, ready to recount what they saw. As the first wave of evidence came together, the preliminary report revealed a severity that could not be ignored. It wasn't just one slap, it was an entire pattern of violence and abuse of power coming to light. David held the report in his hands, eyes scanning each page, burdened but resolute. He understood this investigation was not just about one man, but about exposing a system that had enabled him for too long. And he knew that every step he took now was being watched by a nation, placing its hope in the belief that justice would no longer be blind. In the thick air of tension, David stood up and tapped the table lightly, closing the meeting. "We will go all the way. No one is above the law." The eyes around the table lit with determination, each person knowing they were no longer just investigators, but witnesses to a historical turning point where the truth was being rewritten through every file, every testimony, every piece of undeniable evidence. Stacks of files on Cole Davis piled high on the table, the yellow light casting shadows over aged yellowing pages. The team flipped through each sheet, annotating every past event, from internal reports and detainment records to complaint letters that had once been ignored. Every line revealed the story, cases where Cole was noted to have used forceful measures without being disciplined victim, names listed hastily and then lost in suspicious silence. David Grant leaned against the desk, his eyes fixed on a large screen displaying charts and statistics, every red figure stabbing into his trust in the system. He said nothing, but his colleagues understood the silence was heavy with resolve to uncover everything. As the review dug deeper, the shadows became clearer. Evidence emerged that Cole had once been accused of assaulting a teenager during a night patrol, but the case was filed under insufficient ground. A letter from the boy's mother pleaded that her son had suffered broken ribs after the encounter with police, now resurfacing as proof of a pain long ignored. Her trembling handwriting was read aloud in the meeting room, prompting many to clench their fists in fury. Past interrogations, led by Cole, where he used hostile language to overpower suspects, were replayed from audio recordings, his arrogant voice echoing through the room and sending chills down every spine. Each discovery was like a nail sealing the coffin of Cole's career. It wasn't just one or two cases, but a long chain of abuses masked by a uniform and protected by complicit silence. Investigators exchanged notes rapidly, cross-checking data and comparing with witness statements. The deeper they dug, the more evident it became. The system had allowed one man to twist justice into his personal tool. David did not shy away from his team's gaze. He stood, walked slowly to the front, and said with steel in his voice, "No one stands above the law." The words echoed through the room, making everyone look up, their eyes burning with determination. It was more than just an order for an investigation. It was a reminder of what justice truly meant. From the young investigators just starting out to the seasoned veterans, they all knew this was a moment they could not afford to fail. That declaration was immediately recorded in the meeting minutes and soon leaked when a few reporters caught wind of it. The public saw the words on news sites, and their hearts ignited with renewed belief that this time their voices would not be ignored. And amid the raging storm, the statement, "No one stands above the law," became an anchor holding justice steady in the crashing sea of outrage and hope. In the quiet interrogation room, cold, white light from the ceiling lamp cast down onto the metal table, clearly illuminating the faces of those sitting across from each other. The atmosphere was tense, yet solemn, because every word spoken now carried decisive weight. David Grant sat at the head of the table, his eyes fixed on the middle-aged woman whose hands trembled as she laid them one atop the other. She took a deep breath, her voice hoarse with emotion, but every word rang clear. "I saw him get slapped. He didn't fight back." The testimony was simple, concise, but it froze the entire room. Several investigators gave subtle nods as her account matched the video detail for detail, shattering all arguments, claiming Samuel Grant had provoked the assault. David nodded slightly, signaling the clerk to record it, then looked at the woman with a sympathetic gaze. Samuel was not alone, and the courage of this witness was the first piece unlocking the door to justice. Without letting silence linger, the door opened, and a young student entered, his face tense but eyes resolute. He was the one who had recorded the shocking clip. Holding his phone, he connected it to the large screen, and the video played once again. The sound of the slap, the sight of blood soaking into a tissue appeared vividly. He spoke firmly. "This is the original file, unedited. I'm willing to testify in court." Keystrokes echoed as the investigator took notes. Red lights blinked on recorders, capturing every word. Another team member quickly verified the data, confirming the clip was the original upload untouched. That confirmation rippled through the room, lighting up everyone's eyes. They knew they held in their hands a golden piece of evidence. It wasn't just a recording, but a first-hand witness affirming the truth. The initial tension gradually transformed into a surge of focused energy as each new statement added weight. The woman described how Samuel slumped over the table, his hands trembling but his eyes remained calm. The student recounted how his heart pounded as he hit record and why he decided to share the clip despite knowing it could get him into trouble. Their stories merged, forming a vivid picture where the truth was no longer obscured. David listened closely, nodding at times, asking short, clarifying questions. He didn't need to say moo, it only focused on aligning every detail with the files already compiled. His precision strengthened the witnesses' confidence, making their accounts even more resolute. By the end of the session, the room was filled with a quiet yet powerful sense of resolve, as if they had just laid the foundation for a new house of justice. As he stepped out of the room, David looked through the glass window and saw the woman's once tense face now eased and the young student gripping his phone with quiet pride. He knew that from today the story had gained new witnesses willing to step into the light, and justice, thanks to them, had taken a significant step forward. The interrogation room door opened softly, and in walked a thin man with graying hair and deep, weary eyes. He sat down slowly, clutching a worn old cap in his hands as if it were a talisman to steady himself. In a trembling, low voice, he recounted how years ago, when he was just a working man, he had been arrested by Cole Davis during a night patrol. The official report had listed the charge as disturbing the peace, but in truth he had been beaten brutally in the holding cell. He remembered only the sound of a baton striking his back, Cole's mocking laughter, and the humiliation of having no one believe his cries for help. His testimony fell into the room like a heavy weight, making it clear this wasn't an isolated case, but a vital link in a long chain of abuse. David Grant sat motionless, his gaze locked on the man's face where lines and scars on his hands bore silent witness to that painful memory. Investigators quickly pulled up the old report, its vague language now exposed for what it was, a cover for brutality. Placing the file beside the man's words, a clear picture emerged. Cole Davis had repeatedly used violence to suppress the vulnerable, and the system had let him escape accountability in silence. This new witness didn't just add to the case. They sparked a wave of agreement from others who had stayed silent out of fear. The leaked photos, the video clip, the woman's testimony, the student's confirmation, all of it, now intertwined with the old victim's account, forming a tight web of evidence. There were no more gaps for Cole to hide and no more excuses to offer. A seasoned investigator stared at the summary board and quietly said, "He's been writing his own sentence for years." The remark confirmed what everyone now knew: every act of abuse, no matter how long ago, eventually finds its way into the light. In the corner of the room, the older man sat quietly, hands trembling on the table, but his eyes slowly brightened, finally feeling heard. It was the first time in years his story hadn't been ignored. David walked over, placed a firm hand on his shoulder, and said, "Every word you share is a brick, and we're rebuilding justice with them." The man broke into tears, not from weakness, but because he had waited far too long for the day justice would finally speak. The end-of-day report was printed out, hundreds of pages thick, compiling all the evidence from video footage, new witnesses, old records, and leaked photos. Everything pointed directly at Cole Davis, transforming him from a swaggering man who once called himself the law into a defendant with nowhere left to hide. That chain of evidence was a tightening steel net. Each knot a witness, each piece truth closing in on Cole with no room for escape. And as the final pages were stamped, the entire investigative team understood that a new chapter was about to begin, one where the truth would be judged publicly before all of society. Night fell over the suburban house, the living room dim under a yellowish light reeking of alcohol that smothered the air. Cole Davis sat slumped on the floor, a bottle loosely gripped in his hand, eyes bloodshot, his face twisted like a man utterly lost. A hoarse scream burst from his throat, still sharp. "Everyone's against me." The echo slammed into the bare wall, then bounced back, sounding like a mocking laugh. He hurled the bottle, hard, glass shattering across the room, liquor spilling into a long streak on the cold tile like a bleeding wound he couldn't bandage. In the corner of the room, his wife stood silently, arms wrapped tightly around their small child, trembling against her chest. Her eyes were red, her face full of fear and exhaustion. She had endured too many of his pointless outbursts, drunken rages, and the arrogance that had buried their family in darkness. Cole's shout rang out like a final bell, pushing her to the edge of a decision. Without a word, she bent down, picked up a cloth bag she had packed earlier, draped a coat over her child's shoulders, then turned and walked away. The thudding of footsteps on the wooden stairs jolted Cole. He whipped his head around and shouted, voice cracking, "You're really leaving!" But the woman didn't stop. Her steps were firm, her eyes more resolute than ever. The child looked back, eyes wet, but the mother's grip pulled them forward, allowing no pause for doubt. The door slammed shut, leaving behind a staggering man in an empty room with wind whistling through the doorframe, mixing with the stench of alcohol. In that moment, Cole felt the house stretch wide like a pit ready to swallow him. The family photos on the wall now stood as silent witnesses, reflecting his isolation. He stared at a picture of his wife smiling on their wedding day, then burst into manic laughter, tears spilling onto the cold floor. All the power, all the pride he had once worn now reduced to an empty shell. Outside, the world saw him as a disgrace, and even within his own home he had been left to rot in his bitter collapse. Darkness swallowed the last of the dim light, and Cole clutched his head, howling like a wounded beast, but no one was left to hear. The footsteps of his wife and child were long gone, and the silence that remained was a sentence in itself. Liquor pooled with his shadow on the floor, forming a warped reflection, a symbol of the downfall of a man who had destroyed everything with his own hands. In that thick darkness, Cole Davis crumpled despair tightening around him, marking the beginning of a ruin beyond repair. In the pitch-dark room, with only the ticking of the wall clock breaking the silence, Cole Davis slumped over the chair, his trembling hands fumbling for another bottle of liquor. A sudden sound from the phone on the table made him jump, its screen flaring bright in the dark. The news was clear, the red headline scrolling across FBI launches, full investigation evidence against Cole Davis mounting. His eyes widened, breath quickened each word on the screen like a blade slicing through his chest. His face, flushed from alcohol, turned pale, his gaze vacant, and the phone nearly slipped from his hand. The wave of outrage outside had now become a blade against his throat, and he knew he was being cornered. Cole staggered to his feet, glanced around the now empty house. The noise of the media, the furious comments on social media, seemed to surge in through that small screen, suffocating him. He recalled the sound of his wife carrying their child out the door, remembered the disgusted looks from colleagues, and now it all merged into an invisible verdict society was delivering upon him. Clutching his head, he stumbled, muttering, "No way they made this up. I'm still the law." But the weak words spoken into an empty room sounded no different than a desperate plea. A knock on the door rang out firm and sharp, slicing through the chaos in Cole's mind. He froze, heart pounding wildly, then faster, like war drums. His hand shook as he stepped toward the door, each footstep heavy as stone. The second knock came clearer, followed by a commanding voice, "Police, open up. We have a summons." Sweat poured down his forehead as he inhaled deeply, trying in vain to regain composure. His fingers touched the cold doorknob. He knew what waited on the other side was the end of the arrogance he once wore like impenetrable armor. The door swung open, light from the hallway spilling in, revealing Cole's worn, ashen face. Standing at the threshold were two federal officers, one holding a document stamped with an official seal, their tone leaving no room for refusal. "Mr. Cole Davis, this is an official summons. You are required to appear for the investigation." The paper was held out, the hallway light reflecting off the stark words like a hammer crashing down on the man who once called himself the law. Cole wanted to protest, to scream, but his throat locked up and no sound came. For a moment, he stood, frozen eyes locked on the document, ears ringing with the wind outside the window. His body seemed to collapse inward, legs too heavy to hold him upright. As one officer gestured, Cole was forced to move his feet, dragging across the tile with a tired scrape. His eyes dropped, no trace left of the man who once roared in court, "I am the law." The moment the door closed behind him, Cole knew every escape had sealed shut, and what lay ahead was only the darkness of a judgment long overdue. On the morning of the federal trial, the courthouse steps were packed with people and cameras. Media crews from all over gathered. Broadcast vans lined up with tangled antennas and large banners hung above the gates reading, "Justice for Samuel," a clear sign this was no ordinary hearing but a historic event. Inside the courtroom, every seat in the gallery was filled, hundreds of eyes fixed on the entrance, waiting for the key figures to arrive. A heavy silence blanketed the room as if everyone shared a single heartbeat. When the doors swung open, Samuel Grant appeared, walking slowly but steadily. The white bandage wrapped around his forehead stood out under the lights, his face calm, his eyes free of resentment. With a cane in hand, he stepped up one stair at a time, each movement a living testament to resilience in the face of violence. The entire courtroom rose to its feet, the whispers faded, and many wiped away tears. The image of an old man, hair silver wound, still fresh, yet eyes sharp and unwavering, instantly became the defining symbol of a trial many believed would enter the history books. Moments later, another door opened and Cole Davis was led in. His wrists were bound in shining cuffs, his frame heavy, his face haggard and gray. The arrogance that once echoed through the courtroom was gone. He now slumped in the defendant's chair, eyes wandering, avoiding the burning stares from the crowd behind him. Every camera clicked, every flash of light carved deeper into the image of the man who once declared himself the law, now shackled and beneath the judge's bench. The gallery didn't cheer, didn't shout, only silence remained harsher than any insult. The tension deepened as the judge entered, banging the gavel to call the court to order. His voice rang out firm and unwavering, stating that every eye, every word, every piece of evidence would now stand before justice. At the prosecution's table, thick files were stacked high, filled with testimonies, video footage, and a list of witnesses ready to take the stand. On the defense side, Cole sat with his head down, lips pressed tight, his cuffed hands trembling slightly as if trying to mask the fear he could no longer contain. Samuel took his seat in the witness box, the light catching his face, making it shine at the heart of the courtroom. He needed no grand word. His presence alone held the room in breathless stillness. The eyes watching him were not seeking pity, but a living reminder that dignity can still stand tall after being struck down by brutality. Across from him, Cole lifted his gaze briefly, but within a heartbeat he looked away, unable to bear the weight of that gaze. The trial that day unfolded like a grand play with no script written in advance. Each witness, each video clip, every detail in the case file struck like an arrow aimed straight at Cole Davis. The federal courtroom no longer felt like a cold wall of rigid law, but had become a stage for justice, where an entire community placed its trust. And, in the dense, tense atmosphere, everyone understood that the verdict to come would not only determine one man's fate, but mark a deep and lasting milestone in the fight against injustice and discrimination. The room fell silent as the prosecutor rose, the thick case file in his hands, thudding sharply as it hit the table. He took a deep breath, then spoke loud and clear, each word ringing out. The defendant, Cole Davis, is charged with assault, abuse of power, and discrimination. The statement was firm, without hesitation, and every eye in the room immediately turned toward the defendant's chair. Cole flinched slightly, his face pale, his cuffed hands clenched tight, sweat beginning to bead on his forehead. The scratch of pens filled the air, cameras clicked non-stop, but nothing could drown out the weight pressing down on the courtroom. Each charge landed like a hammer blow. When assault was spoken, the image of Samuel collapsing in a pool of blood flashed through every mind in the room. When abuse of power followed, the past resurfaced old accusations, buried reports. And when the word discrimination echoed, the courtroom seemed to reel, because it wasn't just an indictment of one man, but an accusation against a festering social disease. A murmur swept through the gallery, some nodding, others gripping their seats tightly, their eyes locked on Samuel as if justice itself had taken form before them. In the witness stand, Samuel Grant sat silently, the white bandage on his forehead like a mark carved by truth. He didn't need to speak or show emotion, his hands folded calmly, his gaze steady. Behind him stood David Grant, tall and resolute, his eyes scanning the room, offering both protection for his father and a silent message that justice was being upheld. That gaze, cold and unwavering, held the space together, anchoring the courtroom against the storm of anger rising within it. The moment the two generations stood together, an injured father, a steadfast son behind on him, struck a chord with everyone present. Reporters quickly captured the image and broadcast it across headlines everywhere. The photo of Samuel with the white bandage seated at the witness stand, David standing firmly behind him, spread swiftly and became iconic. Viewers watching from home were visibly moved. In that image they saw not only pain and protection, but proof that even when truth is buried, someone will always rise to lift it back into the light. The prosecutor finished speaking, and the sound of the gavel echoed, confirming that the charges had been officially announced. In that moment, every gaze turned to Cole, the man who had once arrogantly shouted that he was the law, now curled up in his seat, unable to lift his head. The courtroom was silent, but that silence weighed heavily than any spoken condemnation. From the back row, someone leaned over and whispered to a friend, "This moment will go down in history." The words spread, met with quiet nods of agreement. Standing behind his father, David took a deep breath. His hand clenched into a fist, but his voice remained inside. He didn't need to speak. His eyes said enough, declaring that justice would not stop halfway. The courtroom was no longer just a place for legal proceedings, but had become a space where the community witnessed the downfall of a violent man and at the same time the rise of those who refused to bow their heads. And in that cold white light, the image of father and son standing together carved deep the belief that no one stands above the law. The courtroom felt like all sound had been sucked out of the air, everyone holding their breath until the gavel struck with a dry final thud. The judge, face stern, voice deep and steady, spoke into the stillness. "Defendant Cole Davis, this court sentences you to 20 years in prison." The clear, decisive words rang out, cutting through the tension that had hung heavy for days. Each syllable dropped like a blade, sending a tremor through the hearts of the hundreds in attendance. Then, bursting open a moment, everyone understood justice had been affirmed. Immediately after the verdict, the crowd erupted into thunderous applause. The clapping mixed with sobs for many in the room, as if they had just witnessed an old wound finally stitched shut. People embraced shoulders, shaken, tears falling not from helplessness, but from relief, proof that hope was real. Arms were raised, signs still clutched tight, and the phrase, "Justice for Samuel," was repeated over and over, a hymn echoing through a chamber once suffocating with silence. Samuel Grant remained seated, the light catching the white bandage on his forehead, his eyes closing slightly as if releasing the burden he had carried for so long. He didn't smile, didn't cry. He simply tilted his head, inhaled deeply as though he could finally breathe after days of being crushed. A hand landed gently on his shoulder, and when he turned it was David, his son's gaze firm and unwavering, silently telling him the long road had reached its end. In that look, Samuel saw pride and protection, a thread between two generations, transforming pain into strength. Across the room, Cole Davis hung his head, his body slumped as if all life had drained out. The clink of metal cuffs echoed as he was restrained, his face vacant, lips moving but saying nothing, no words left that could redeem him. Every gaze in the room turned to him, not with glee, but with a finality that marked him as proof that abusive power does not last. In that instant, Cole understood the sentence came not just from the judge, but from the entire community, from a truth he had trampled for far too long. The applause, the cries, the voices calling Samuel's name all blended together, rising through the courtroom and out into the world via the lens of the waiting cameras. Breaking news flashed across phone screens, headlines in bold across every outlet: Cole Davis sentenced to 20 years in prison. That courtroom closed on a surge of tears and joy, leaving behind a milestone that none who were present would ever forget. And in that moment, as justice was spoken aloud in resolute words, the community's faith was reignited, casting light on the road ahead. In the moment when the applause still echoed, Samuel Grant slowly turned turned around, his eyes weary yet clear. He saw his son standing tall like a pillar, his steady gaze reflecting unshakable conviction. Samuel gave a slight nod, a small gesture, carrying a current of emotion, both gratitude and pride, as if to say he fully trusted the next generation. That nod made David clench his fist, his gaze growing even more resolute, a silent vow that justice would never again be trampled. Across the room, Cole Davis suddenly sprang up, his body restrained in cuffs, but his scream tore through the air. He shouted, his voice hoarse and frenzied. "I am the law!" The cry rang out across the chamber, but this time no one flinched, no one feared. It sounded like the last desperate gasp of a man clinging to the illusion of power while everything around him had collapsed. He thrashed, eyes wide and wild, but two federal officers held him tight, dragging him forward with heavy steps. Immediately, the chant, "Justice for All," erupted from the courtroom, rising into a unified wave. The powerful sound drowned out Cole's deranged shouting, reducing him to a small figure swallowed by a crowd hungry for justice. Bright eyes turned forward, voices rang loud and in unison, transforming the once heavy courtroom into a space where the community declared its oath. The scream of one man faded, replaced by a collective cry echoing like a song of truth and dignity. Cole was dragged out of the courtroom, his feet dragging, mouth still mumbling nonsense. The heavy door shut behind him, cutting off the faint sounds. Inside, the chants continued, faces wet with tears but shining with light. Samuel looked at his son once more, his trembling hand resting on his chest as if releasing a burden at last. David stood tall in the center of the room, took a deep breath, and let the words "justice for all" strike his heart, turning into strength for the road ahead. And in that moment, history recorded the fall of a tyrant and the rise of an entire community. Night fell over the central square where thousands of candles glowed, forming a river of light stretching endlessly. Amid the packed sea of people, voices rose into the sky, no more silence. The sound echoed off surrounding buildings, ringing out in a steady rhythm, like a battle drum that the entire community marched to. Every face was lit up by the flames, eyes blazing with resolve, no longer afraid but filled with unwavering belief that silence could never be the answer. Countless signs were raised high, bold words like collective vows, turning the square into a place where justice was spoken from the hearts of tens of thousands. The chants outside surged into every school, every classroom. Teachers didn't shy away but turned the incident into a civic lesson, teaching that justice wasn't some distant concept but alive in every act of courage. Students opened their notebooks and wrote "No more silence" as a new mantra, then stayed after class to debate passionately, analyzing why the truth must be protected. In young eyes, the image of Samuel with the white bandage on his forehead and David standing firmly beside him had become a clear symbol etched deeper than any statistic in a textbook. It wasn't just schools, but everyday families that changed. Dinner conversations no longer revolved around trivial matters, but burst with debates about power, dignity, and responsibility. Parents looked at their children and shared how silence had brought pain across generations, and how now they could raise their voices through action. In churches, pastors preached that justice was the light of faith and truth, the foundation for a strong community. Every sermon was answered with resounding amen, rising alongside the flickering candles held by each worshiper. That night, the square wasn't just a place to light flames, it became a mirror for the community to reflect on itself. Young and old faces of all colors and walks of life now stood as one. No more division, no more hesitation, only a powerful unity born from the shared realization that silence meant allowing injustice to continue. From every corner, people told one another the story of Samuel and the historic trial, affirming that justice had risen from a single slap, and its echo had awakened something deep in every heart. In the glow of candlelight and the roar of chants, something had changed forever. The community would no longer back down, no longer longer place blind faith in hollow promises. They had claimed their own power, turning a painful story into the foundation of awakening. And from that moment on, the square burned not only with candlelight, but with the fire of justice blazing in every soul. From the candlelit square, the chant, "No More Silence," spread through the streets, reaching the hearts of the youth. Thousands of young people gathered, forming long lines, raising their fists in unison, shouting aloud, "No more silence." Their energy surged like a waterfall, creating a powerful rhythm that sent chills through everyone watching. On their shoulders was not only the fire of youth, but also the responsibility of carrying forward the legacy of justice passed down by previous generations. Their youthful faces glowed in candlelight and phone screens, sweat shimmering on their foreheads, but their eyes shone with resolve, showing they were ready to carry the long journey ahead. Universities, student halls, and cafes echoed with lively debates. Calls to action spread across social media, urging young people to abandon apathy and turn outrage into action. One student group wrote, "We can't stay on the sidelines because silence is complicity." The post was shared millions of times, becoming a rallying cry that pushed youth across the country to rise together. That spirit grew into a widespread movement, shaking the foundations of society as young voices from cities to rural towns united in a bold declaration of their generation's voice. Faith in justice, long shaken by years of inequality, was restored not through official promise, but through the strength of the community itself. Eyes, once filled with doubt, now reflected hope hearts. Once disillusioned, now beat with renewed belief that justice was still alive, waiting to be rekindled. Churches, schools, and civil organizations echoed the story as proof that when truth is brought to light, it creates a chance for true societal change. That belief began to live not just in slogans or banners, but as fuel that empowered the community to affirm that justice belongs to everyone. In the days that followed, a wave of events unfolded from public forums to small discussion circles. Citizens debated reform, youth groups proposed new initiatives, and media outlets continued broadcasting Samuel Grant's story as a constant reminder. Society, in unison, emphasized that justice must no longer live only in documents, but be etched into daily life. From the candles lit that night, a new belief had been ignited, a belief that one brutal slap could not extinguish the light of justice, but instead sparked a fire within a generation, declaring loudly, "No more silence." On international television networks, evening talk shows were broadcast live, drawing millions of viewers. Hosts opened their programs with bold statements. "This is a historic turning point." They replayed footage of the candlelit square intercut with the video of Samuel being assaulted in court, then compared it to the moment when the crowd shouted in unison, "Justice for all." That stark contrast became a powerful visual testimony to a society in transformation where pain had given birth to an unprecedented force of unity. Commentators affirmed that the moment transcended a single city, becoming a global milestone for justice and human rights. Renowned scholars joined the discussions, offering profound insights. A law professor spoke in a steady voice that slap was a stain on law enforcement, but at the same time it marked the beginning of an irreversible reform process. He explained that every system only truly evolves when forced to confront its own failure. And in this case, the failure was exposed under the blinding spotlight of global media. Viewers listened intently, many nodding in agreement, recognizing that the truth had compelled society to reflect and begin to change. The talk shows also welcomed social activists, independent journalists, and even artists who had shared the video clip. One journalist said, "The moment Samuel lifted his head, bandaged and bruised it, moved beyond the personal, it became a symbol of human dignity." A famous artist added, "When the public unites, one person's voice can become a wave strong enough to break down the hardest wall." Their words resonated, deeply quoted, and reshared endlessly on social media, fueling a new cycle of momentum around the message at the heart of it all. From New York to Paris, from Nairobi to Tokyo, commentary programs devoted extended airtime to dissecting the story. A host on a major Asian network asked what made the world care about an incident that seemed so small inside a courtroom. The answer came from thousands of viewer messages, because it was raw truth striking a universal chord of pain. That resonance turned a local trial into a global event, forcing those in power to acknowledge they could no longer stand untouched by the rising tide. Under the bright lights of television, as the words "a historic turning point" and the beginning of change echoed everywhere, people understood that the story of Samuel and David did not end with the verdict, but opened a new chapter. That chapter is being continued by the media, by the community, and by the very people who are keeping the flame of justice alive in their hearts. In the charged atmosphere of the talk shows, the appearance of direct witnesses from the trial left audiences silent. A middle-aged woman sat across from the host, her hands clasped but her voice firm. "I saw Mr. Samuel get slapped. He didn't fight back, he just looked up with calm eyes." Her words brought the studio to stillness, with many wiping away tears as the moment was relived. Next came the young student who filmed the video that went global, wearing a simple shirt. He spoke of the moment his hands trembled holding the phone and the inner conflict before releasing the clip. "I knew I might be threatened, but I couldn't let the truth be buried," he said, greeted by a long, unending round of applause. International broadcasts replayed every moment of their story, cut in between candlelit images, crowds of protesters, and the hashtag spreading worldwide. Quick interviews after the shows showed a wave of public empathy. A young man in Paris told a reporter, "They speak for those who had to stay silent." A mother in South Africa said, "Looking at Samuel, I remember my father. He also suffered injustice. But now I believe truth can win." That ripple needed no further explanation, because the witnesses and the student had proved it through their courage. From those studios, a new slogan rose in unison. On social media, beneath every article, people left the same words: "Justice has prevailed." The short phrase carried far, becoming the community's final statement after days of outrage and waiting. In city squares, the chant echoed like a drumbeat. In classrooms, it was written on boards as a moral lesson. In churches, it blended into prayers. The power of the people turned that phrase into a symbol, spreading beyond borders, becoming humanity's united voice against injustice. That night, during the late news broadcast, images of the witness and student facing the audience were woven with the chants from the streets, forming a powerful harmony. Viewers everywhere stood up not just to honor them, but to remind themselves that this victory belonged to everyone who dared to speak out. "Justice has prevailed" was no longer just a phrase, but a belief etched deep into the hearts of millions, paving the way for a society where truth is not silenced and dignity is placed above all else. Inside the crowded law office, light from desk lamps spilled over stacks of files piled high like mountains. The rustle of paper and the rapid clicking of keyboards filled the air, all focused on the newly filed lawsuits. A former victim of Cole Davis sat at the intake desk, his face aged, but his eyes clear and bright. He placed a thick file down and spoke with a trembling yet firm voice. "I'm filing this not just for myself, but for everyone who was left behind." The room fell silent, then swelled with energy, because everyone understood that the door to justice had truly opened. Behind him, more people stepped forward, carrying folders and complaint letters once buried and forgotten, now placed on the desk with weighty thuds like bricks hurled at a wall of silence. Young lawyers moved quickly, taking notes, sorting files, their voices laced with urgency and indignation. They immediately sent formal notifications submissions to the Federal Investigation Agency stating clearly that this was not an isolated incident but part of a systemic pattern of abuse. Within days, old complaints were compiled into an expanding list of victims, students, laborers, immigrants, even minors who had been unjustly detained. Each reopened story became a piece of a puzzle, gradually forming a full picture of a law enforcement system that for years had enabled brutality. Under mounting pressure, the authorities were forced to expand the internal investigation. Departments that had long remained quiet were now in turmoil. Old case files were reopened and archived footage was reviewed frame by frame. A special committee was formed, bringing together inspectors, prosecutors, and civilian representatives working around the clock. Each revelation fueled public outrage. Internal reports had been edited, complaints dismissed without cause, and in some cases, victims had been threatened into silence. These facts exposed a system riddled with cracks, where wrongdoing was shielded rather than punished. In emergency hearings, officers who had stayed silent now faced a barrage of difficult questions. Many lowered their heads, sweat dripping down their faces as they were asked about oversight responsibilities. Some younger officers stood up admitting they had witnessed violence but had been too afraid to report it. Those confessions made the room even more tense, yet they also sparked hope because for the first time the truth was no longer being smothered by fear. News broadcasts aired continuously, showing images from intense hearings that stirred both anger and renewed determination among the public to demand change. Inside the law office, phones rang non-stop, hundreds of calls pouring in from all over. People shared bitter experiences, many sobbing as they recalled moments of being ignored or beaten without anyone standing up for them. Everyone wanted their name added to the witness list, hoping to lend their voice so the upcoming trial would not only seal Cole Davis's fate, but mark the beginning of a full reckoning. Major newspapers wrote that a system is being scrutinized to its roots and society had run out of patience for ambiguity. The atmosphere felt like a quiet but unyielding revolution as every piece of truth was brought into the light. From the old victims' lawsuits to the expanded investigations, a clear path toward reform had emerged. And in the eyes of those working late into the night in the law office, the light of justice had begun to shine, no longer just a slogan echoing in the squares, but a tangible force drilling into the deepest layers of power. When the internal investigation results were released, the nation was stunned. The report, hundreds of pages long, exposed a series of violations committed by officers once thought to be untouchable. Their names flooded the media, accompanied by lists of covered-up incidents sparking widespread outrage. Under immense pressure, authorities had no choice but to issue mass terminations. Not only those directly involved in acts of violence, but also the supervisors who turned a blind eye and enabled abuse were removed from their posts. Scenes of badges being stripped and uniforms reclaimed aired on national television, marking the end of an era tolerated wrongdoing. In many local police departments, a heavy silence hung in the air. Some officers left headquarters with heads down, avoiding all stares. Others walked away quietly as angry crowds gathered outside. People watched and chanted calls for transparency, seeing these purges as just the first step toward reclaiming justice. In some places, the outrage surged to demands for more. Not just a few disciplinary actions, but a complete institutional overhaul. Inside, oversight committees' meetings stretched late into the night. Legal experts, sociologists, and community representatives presented reform proposals non-stop. Some called for independent oversight mechanisms so police could no longer investigate themselves. Others pushed for mandatory camera systems in all operations to eliminate the blind spots of unchecked power. Each suggestion was carefully recorded, quickly added to the legislative agenda. For the first time in decades, law enforcement reform was no longer an empty promise, but an urgent demand from the entire society. Police academies were forced to change their curricula. Lessons on civil rights, racial equality, and accountability to the community were officially introduced. Young officers were required to attend direct dialogue sessions with citizens, listening to victim stories stories to understand that their role was not a shield but a responsibility. New training programs were launched emphasizing that the people are not subjects but partners to be protected. Those words echoed, becoming the guiding principle for a new generation of law enforcement. Outside in society, trust began to rekindle. People started to feel that their voices truly mattered, that the candles lit in the squares had not burned in vain. Local communities discussed how to participate in oversight, from neighborhood groups to civil society organizations, all eager to be part of the reform process. That unity became a constant pressure, preventing the system from slipping back into old patterns. Every reform move, every dismissal was publicly scrutinized under the eyes of the people. In the broader picture, the downfall of a few individuals mattered less than the fact that the entire system was being rebuilt from the ground up. Painful lessons from the past were deeply engraved, then transformed into tangible action. Faith in justice was restored not just through chance, but through each deliberate step of reform. Citizens could now walk past police stations with heads held high, knowing justice was no longer a distant slogan, but a living part of daily life. And it was this awakening that marked the beginning of a new era, where power is held accountable and human dignity becomes the foundation of every decision. In the quiet space of the City Museum, soft yellow light fell across the exhibit walls where history was told through images and artifacts. At the center of the main hall, a brand new bronze plaque was mounted with solemn care, its engraved words gleaming. Justice belongs to dignity, not skin color. The inscription wasn't flowery, but enough to make anyone pause, read slowly, reflect, and feel their heart skip a beat. Many stood silently for a long time before the plaque, eyes glassy, remembering the journey of an elderly man who once collapsed in a courtroom, but became an enduring symbol of justice. Samuel Grant entered his steps slower now, but his eyes still clear. He walked toward the plaque, lifted a trembling hand, and gently touched the sharp contours of each letter. That touch felt like a bridge between present and past, between the pain he had endured and the hope now being built. In that moment, the entire room fell silent, no one speaking, all eyes fixed on a humble man whose legacy extended far beyond his personal life. Samuel said nothing because he knew the greatest legacy lay not in declarations, but in the lasting power of truth he had carried. On the surrounding walls, images from the case were displayed, the photo of Samuel with the white bandage on his forehead, protest posters, and the hashtags that once blanketed the internet. Between them were excerpts from David's speeches, witness testimonies, and diary entries from the student who had bravely shared the video. Together, they formed a continuous narrative, guiding visitors from the initial pain to the moment of triumph. People moved slowly, eyes shining, while children held their parents' hands and asked what each image meant, and were told that justice isn't just one person's story, it belongs to everyone. Samuel stood still before the plaque for a long time, as if he were retracing the entire journey. In his eyes, there was no anger, only peace, because he knew what once seemed meaningless had now been etched into something eternal. He turned to look out the glass window where sunlight streamed in and reflected on the engraved words like a promise for the future. That image left many in the room silent as they realized Samuel's legacy wasn't only in the plaque, but in the hearts of those who had witnessed and learned the lesson of dignity. Reporters present captured the moment, and within hours the photo of Samuel placing his hand on the engraved words spread across social media. The caption, "His legacy will live on," appeared everywhere, becoming an inspirational message for a new generation. In schools, teachers projected the image as a civic lesson, emphasizing that justice only exists when people value dignity above all prejudice. In churches, the photo was hung with honor, becoming a spiritual symbol that reminded communities that prayers must be paired with action. The bronze plaque in the museum wasn't just an exhibit. It had become a milestone marking a historical chapter. People came to take photos and share them online, but more than that, they came seeking the belief that the past had laid a strong foundation for the future. Samuel smiled gently, his eyes quietly reaching out to his son David, standing behind him as if to say the rest of the journey now belonged to the next generation. In that moment, his legacy was no longer one man's story, but a shared flame lighting the way for an entire community. David Grant stood silently beside his father, his tall frame like a steady shield, eyes fixed on the bronze plaque engraved with the words, "Justice belongs to dignity, not skin color." In that moment, pride surged through him. He didn't see a father once brought down by violence, but a resilient witness who stood firm to let the truth shine. His eyes held a deep trust, not only in Samuel, but in the community that had turned pain into legacy, ensuring that justice was no longer distant. In the museum's soft light, the parallel posture of father and son formed a powerful image, beyond individual storylines, symbolizing generational inheritance. Around them, people from all over gathered, lining up to see the plaque and capture the moment. Many families brought young children, pointing to the engraved words, patiently explaining that this wasn't just Samuel's story, but a lesson for everyone. Cameras and phones flashed continuously, capturing the moment. Samuel touched the inscription with David beside him, pride in his eyes. The photos flooded social platforms within hours, accompanied by brief yet powerful captions, "Dignity over color. Justice prevails, a living symbol." Those photos quickly became a new wave, spreading from the local community to every corner of the world. In many cities, youth groups reprinted the image of Samuel and David, posting it on walls, hanging it in classrooms, turning it into a visual symbol of the pursuit of justice. International media republished the story with headlines like "From Pain to Legacy," praising the unyielding journey of an elderly man who refused to bow down. Readers flooded the comment sections, many expressing how deeply moved they were by the image of father and son standing side by side, one bearing the scars of the past, the other becoming a steady pillar, both affirming the power of truth. Inside the museum, the stream of visitors never slowed. Some quietly laid small bouquets at the foot of the plaque, others knelt to pray, and some gently touched the engraved words to feel a connection to the message. A group of high school students came on a field trip, their teacher asking them to take photos and write reflections afterward. Soft murmurs filled the room, innocent questions from children mixing with the emotion of adults, creating an atmosphere that was both solemn and warm. Justice was no longer an abstract idea, but a tangible presence that anyone could see, touch, and feel with their heart. Outside the museum, the photos continued to be printed and distributed to citizens at community events. At public forums, memorials, and even graduation ceremonies, the image of Samuel and David remained visible, a reminder that every generation bears the duty to safeguard justice. From a bronze plaque, from an act that seemed small, a far-reaching movement was born. People carried with them the belief that history isn't written only in ink, but in unity and collective action. And as they left the museum, holding the image and sharing the story, that message traveled farther, planting seeds in hearts that had never witnessed the moment but were now part of the justice journey. In the vast lecture hall of a prestigious university, morning light filtered through tall windows, casting a soft glow over rows of students seated neatly, their faces filled with anticipation. On the podium, David Grant stood tall, his voice warm and steady as it echoed through the space. He began with a sentence that silenced the entire hall. "That day, I wasn't just an FBI agent, I was a son." The clarity of that statement made many students instinctively lower their heads, eyes glistening because they could sense that behind the suit and badge was a heart carrying deep scars, a son's instinct to protect his father. Each word he spoke didn't come off as a lecture, but as a sincere confession that struck straight into the listener's emotions. David recounted the moment he saw his father collapse, blood staining his shirt, and the wave of helplessness that rose with restrained fury. He said that if he had acted as an officer, then things might have turned out differently, but he chose first to rise as a son because justice begins at home in the defense of what we hold told closest. That story weighed heavily over the lecture hall, with many students quietly wiping away tears. They weren't just hearing about a historic case, they were learning a profound lesson that justice isn't a distant concept, but one rooted in human relationships and each person's duty to those they love. The hall remained silent, broken only by David's measured, resonant voice. He didn't shy away from speaking of fear and pressure, but emphasized that the truth must never be ignored, even when it makes us tremble. He looked directly at the young faces before him, affirming that this generation must hold on to that belief, because if they stay silent, history will repeat itself with wounds that never heal. A student in the front row let out a soft sob, comforted by friends nearby, though their eyes never left the podium, where every word David spoke was becoming a quiet fire burning in their hearts. He went on to speak of the bronze plaque in the museum where his father had placed his hand, and affirmed that justice belongs to dignity, not skin color. He said that each generation may face different battles, but the root is always the affirmation of human dignity. If you hold on to that, David paused briefly, you won't just be students, engineers, or lawyers, you will be protectors of justice in this society. The hall echoed with the sound of deep breaths, many faces lit with resolve, some eyes misty but filled with pride. When the speech ended, the hall erupted into prolonged applause, many students rising to their feet, some rushing toward the podium just to shake his hand. Words of thanks rang out, simple but heartfelt. Someone whispered they would never forget this morning because it had planted in them the firm belief that justice is not a privilege but a shared responsibility. David smiled, bowed his head in gratitude, his eyes reflecting hope as he looked at the determination on those young faces. In that moment, the lecture hall was no longer just a place of study, it had become a cradle of belief, where the next generation was entrusted with the hard-earned lessons of the past to carry forward with strength. The hall fell silent as David Grant paused, a steely glint in his eyes, his deep voice ringing out each word as if carving them into memory. Justice does not stay silent. It waits for someone to rise. The statement echoed across the room, freezing hundreds of students in place as if they had just been handed a torch. Many tilted their heads to write it in their notebooks, and others quietly typed it into their phones, instantly sharing it on social media. In that moment, the atmosphere brimmed with conviction, as if an entire generation had just been entrusted with a solemn new duty. David lowered his voice, but his gaze remained sharp. He reminded them that anyone can choose silence for safety, but that silence only allows darkness to endure. He shared how throughout his life he had seen too many people choose to step back, and the cost had always been the suffering of innocent victims. That message brought tears to the eyes of several students in the front rows as they realized the story was no longer about one family, it had become a call to all. A young student stood up, voice trembling yet firm. "We promise not to stay silent." Applause broke out, swelling like a wave across the room. In the eyes of the young, there was a glow of renewed belief. They now understood that they were not just learners of knowledge, but authors of justice yet to come. David gave a quiet smile, nodded in acknowledgement of the promise, then stepped back from the podium, letting the applause merge with the rising chants. Outside the lecture hall, the crowd dispersed, but no one left in silence. Groups of students clustered together in discussion, some holding phones aloft, live-streaming the message they had just heard. In nearby cafes, the phrase, "Justice does not stay silent, it waits for someone to rise," became the topic of passionate debate. People repeated it, reflected on it, and shared it as if turning the words into their own personal pledge. On social media, the quote quickly climbed the trending charts, accompanied by photos of David. Standing tall in the light, the hall behind him filled with tearful, resolute students. In the days that followed, other schools began hosting forums using David's words as the central theme. Teachers organized open discussions, students shared their reflections, reflections and wrote essays on civic responsibility. News outlets reported extensively, calling it a generational message and emphasizing that what once happened would no longer be forgotten. At community meetings, people quoted his words, treating them as a collective oath. The message's echo moved beyond lecture halls, reaching into every corner from small households to international conferences. The story of Samuel Grant and the fateful slap gradually came to a close, but its resonance endured. It didn't end like a sorrowful page of history, but as a heroic ballad left to many generations. The candles lighting up the square, the tears in the courtroom, the voices of youth all merged into an indelible legacy. And when the younger generation repeated David's words, they weren't just invoking the past, they were shaping the future. In the community's memory, the story became a mirror, reminding all that justice only stays silent when people choose silence. And when one person rises, the flame spreads, burning away fear and clearing the path for change. The lesson left behind wasn't in the satisfaction of a verdict, but in the power of unity and steadfast resolve, and in the belief that human dignity must never be devalued. From museum to classroom, from family to society, the message echoed, passed down through generations. And the new generation, as they walk that same path, will know they are moving in the light of a story that taught humanity justice never sleeps. It only waits for brave hands to lift and hold it steady. As the story closed, the most enduring image was the moment Samuel Grant placed his trembling hand on the bronze plaque in the museum beside him. David Grant, his eyes full of pride. From a brutal slap in a courtroom, the journey had grown into a wave of social upheaval where truth was illuminated, and those once disregarded became symbols. Samuel, the calm father bearing the scar on his forehead, but with an unshaken heart, had not bowed to violence. David, the son, not only defended his father, but also carried the role of agent to restore justice to its rightful place. Together, they wrote a new chapter, one that allowed the community to rediscover a trust long shaken. What made this story a legacy was not the pain, but how that pain was transformed into action. The protests, the glowing candles in the square, the chants of justice for all proved that the community would no longer accept silence. When the media stepped in, when each witness bravely stepped into the light, when the world shared a single message in unison, that was the moment truth transcended borders. The story didn't end in the courtroom, it became a spreading flame, igniting belief in dignity and equality. The violations were exposed, the ones who abused their power brought to light, dozens of officers dismissed, and an entire system forced to change from its roots. It was not just the fall of one individual, but the awakening of an entire society. Every lawsuit refiled, every witness who dared to speak out, every investigation reopened became a step forward, proving that justice never dies. It only waits to be awakened by courage and unity. And in that process, Samuel and David were not just two individuals, but the spiritual anchor for an entire movement. The first lesson this story offers is the value of steadfastness. Samuel Grant, though knocked down, held a calm gaze, never letting hatred consume him. That composure was proof that dignity is greater than violence. The next lesson came from David Grant, who turned his love for his father into action to protect justice. He reminded everyone that sometimes we act not just out of professional duty, but out of blood-bound responsibility. In the lecture hall, his words rang out. Justice doesn't stay silent, it waits for someone to rise, becoming a message to the new generation that everyone has a role in defending the truth. Another vital lesson is the power of collective strength. One slaps may target one man, but when a community rises, it becomes a wake-up call for an entire nation. Citizens lit candles, students shouted, the media reported, and witnesses spoke up together, forming a chorus that left no room for injustice to hide. It proved that justice, isn't the product of one person or one title, but the result of collective belief passed from one generation to the next. By the end of the story, the audience witnessed not only the reckoning of Cole Dabbs, but also the birth of a new legacy. A legacy of resilience, of fatherly love, of community solidarity, and of the belief that human dignity stands above all prejudice. The photos of Samuel beside David circulated everywhere, not just to commemorate, but to remind us that justice must be protected every day. And as the new generation takes in that lesson, they'll understand that truth, even when buried in darkness, will always find its way to the light as long as someone dares to rise and keep it alive.